personal ways. These conversations deserve respect, patience, and compassion, never anger or judgment. Before I close today, I want to speak briefly to the education legislation that Bill 9 pertains to. The Education Amendment Act ensures that parents are involved in critical decisions involving their young children's identity, well-being, and development. This legislation continues to ensure transparency, communication, and partnership between schools and parents, something that Alberta families overwhelmingly expect. Bill 9 is about responsibility. As elected officials, it's our responsibility to protect children, to support families, and to continue to preserve fairness. It's about ensuring that the laws in this legislature are passed in good faith, based on evidence and public consultation, but that they're not left in limbo for years. It's about recognizing the limits of courts and the rightful authority of elected officials when it comes to shaping public policy. Madam Speaker, most of all, it is about protecting our children. It's time to let children be children. With that, I move second reading of Bill 9. Thank you.
Are there others to join the debate? Seeing the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, fair warning, I do intend to use my full time this evening because this is important. It's important for us to really reflect on what the Minister just said, but also on what this government is truly doing. And I intend to spend some time with all of you doing this. And perhaps I'll start with two things. Number one, I just want to say thank you to the folks in the gallery, to the folks watching at home today. I know, you feel like you're fighting the same fight over and over and over again, a fight simply for dignity, a fight simply to allow every single person lucky enough to share this land to live a life of authenticity, a life free of bullying, a life without a government that feels like it's forever stripping away your rights and your freedoms. And thank you for that. Thank you for being this battle. Thank you for inspiring the work that we do every day. Madam Speaker, I'm going to start by telling you about what I did last night. Strange place to start, but that is where I will start. So last night, the member for Edmonton-Glenora very kindly invited me to an informal memorial service for a former member of this House, Alex McEachern. It was a very weird thing for her to do because she was inviting me to speak at a memorial for someone I didn't really know. And I did. She gave me some biodata that I read about him. He'd been critic of this and that, and he worked for these issues. And I was a little confused as to why she had invited me there. But as the evening wore on, I realized precisely why. Because she wanted me to hear from the people who had worked with Alex McEachern. Those were different times then. Their battles were different. This side of the House, well, let's say we didn't have this many people. And they were not fighting to be in government the way that we're fighting to be in government now. But they were fighting. They were fighting hard in what felt like a losing battle for things that really mattered. And Alex McEachern was driven from the day he started to the day he passed earlier this year by an intense desire to make Alberta better for everyone. And last night I had the chance to speak with someone else I'd never met, another former member of this Assembly, a man called Tom Sigurdsson, who served in the 1980s and 1990s in this Assembly. And he walked up to me and kind of got close and said, "There's something I need you to know. I need you to know about my greatest failure as a member of this Assembly. Twice I tried to enshrine some basic dignity and human rights for LGBTQ people in this Assembly. And twice the government turned me down." And then he was reflecting, and he said, "You know, what actually brought in those rights was two things. Number one was a court decision right here in Alberta, a court decision that said that a man called Delvin Green could not be fired from his job because of his sexual identity." Yeah. I was just coming up in public life at that time. I was a student leader at the time at the University of Calgary. And I remember that very well. And I remember the then Premier, Ralph Klein, who I knew very well as the former Mayor of Calgary, someone whose funeral I got to speak at despite the fact that we were political rivals for a long time. And I remember Ralph Klein standing up and saying, we're going to use the notwithstanding clause because we don't believe in this court decision. And activists and regular people went out to him and said, do you believe in human rights or don't you? Yeah. And then he saw the folks on the other side, and they were so hateful to Ralph Klein that he said, I will never be on their side of history. I'm not going to use the notwithstanding clause because I want to be on the right side of history. People who sit with me have a lot of criticisms of that Premier. And the gentleman sitting right to my right is going to kick me in the shin if I say anything nice about him. But I'll tell you this. On that note, Ralph Klein stood on the right side of history. I wish I could say the same about my colleagues opposite. And we're going to reflect a lot on what this legislation says. We're going to go into deep arguments on what the Ministry of Justice just said, which was pretty shocking in the fact that it is simply not what parents are experiencing today. But you know, I thought maybe I might start, since I just had the opportunity, feels like forever ago, but just a couple of weeks ago, to give my maiden speech in this chamber. I talked about my deeply held values, about where I came from, and about what I stand for. So I thought I might start by reading big chunks of another maiden speech that was made in this chamber. This speech was made on May 28, 2012. When I'm done my career in politics, said this member, it is my hope that Section 7 of the Charter will state that everyone has the right to life, liberty, security of the person, the right to own and enjoy property, the right not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. And she went on for a little while about that. My constituents will discover, she said, if they haven't already, that I talk a lot about freedom. Well, she sure does. Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that's the section that's being notwithstanded. Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms enumerates the fundamental freedoms that are guaranteed in this country, in this province. The first fundamental freedom enumerated in the Charter is the freedom of conscience and religion. I would note that this freedom was deemed so important by Pierre Elliott Trudeau and the Charter's other drafters that it's right up there at the top. The second fundamental freedom is the freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. Third is freedom of peaceful assembly, and fourth is freedom of association. We've begun to see dangerous warning signs in Alberta that our fundamental freedoms are at risk. If municipal leaders and school board officials can't speak out against the government out of fear that they might lose grants, where is their free speech? I'm going to pause there for a moment. I think you can probably guess who that member was, who in her maiden speech in this legislature felt the importance to talk about these fundamental freedoms. Of course, that person now has the humbling and huge responsibility of being the Premier of Alberta. Wow. But is it really the same person? And I'm going to stop on this one just for a moment. I have more, but I'll stop here for just a moment. If municipal leaders and school board officials can't speak out against the government, where is the free speech? Madam Speaker, a member of this House just this week wrote an open letter on her office letterhead, taxpayer-funded, saying that a citizen in her riding, simply because they were a teacher or a principal, ought not to speak out against this government and accuse them of using their taxpayer-funded position to overthrow the government, paraphrasing. Yet the leader of this government says, where is the free speech if taxpayer-funded people cannot speak out against government? Now, I suppose it's okay. Let's keep going. If parents can't teach their kids the tenets of their faith without fear of being hauled before a Human Rights Commission, where is the freedom? If landowners can't meet without having government spies in attendance, where is the freedom of association? If the government can retaliate against popular artistic performance groups by denying them the use of a government-owned facility, where is the freedom of assembly? It's funny, isn't it? It's almost like I picked this out to talk about things that this government has been fighting against. Landowners not meeting without government spies nearby. Just this summer, we had a situation where one of my colleagues had the opportunity to speak to a landowners group and was shouted down by government staffers and members opposite because the landowners couldn't meet without the government knowing what they were talking about. Where is, as that member said, the freedom of association? I might also add that this government not 3 weeks ago used the notwithstanding clause precisely because the Supreme Court had determined that freedom of association includes the freedom to collectively bargain. So I think this particular member would be forgiven for if she was asking today, where is the freedom of association? She had some very good lines then in her maiden speech, and she said this. This is a direct quote. "The great challenge of our time is for us to re-embrace our fundamental freedoms. They were not granted to us by government, and they cannot be taken away from us by government. This is my mission in public life, and this is why I felt called to public service. For me, that job begins now." As recently as 2023, people in this province voted for that vision. They voted for that person. They voted in some 40 colleagues for that person because they believed in that vision. So I'll quote again from the speech. Where is the free speech? Where is the freedom of religion? Where is the freedom of association? And where is the freedom of assembly? I'll add to that. Where is the person who made that speech? Yeah. Where is the person who believes so deeply in freedom that she said the entire role of her political life would be to get more freedom? In fact, more recently, that same person said in 2024, quote, "I think I'm the most freedom-loving premier we have in this country," unquote. Quote, "I'm probably the most freedom-loving politician we've ever had in this country. I made sure we reinstalled freedom when I got back elected." And the members opposite can say hear, hear, but it rings so hollow because they know it's not true. Because this is the only, one of them is trying, and even his colleagues will not join in because they know that this premier is the first ever premier in Alberta history to knowingly pass a law that she knew was unconstitutional. And every single member opposite, not one of them spoke up in defense of that, but every single one of them dutifully stood up and voted to restrict people's human rights. The hypocrisy is galling, Madam Speaker. Yes. The hypocrisy is shocking, and Albertans deserve so much better. But let's go further. When these laws were first passed, just a year ago, not even a year ago, the Premier said, quote, "We have rights that are independent of particular laws. They exist regardless of what the laws are. It's not that the laws grant the rights, it's that the laws codify the rights that already exist. We are naturally, just by the endowment from the Creator, free and equal." Yet just this week, that same person said, nope, the legislature is supreme and we decide who people's human rights are. It's not the same person. Or if it is the same person, suddenly political expediency plays far beyond any values. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, she further said, has an important section, Section 26. What it says is, quote, that the guarantees in this Charter of certain rights and freedoms should not be construed as denying the existence of any other rights or freedoms that exist in Canada. It allows for the fact that it might not be a complete list. Unfortunately, from time to time, the courts have acted as certain rights don't exist as a result of them not being enumerated, unquote. So indeed, Now she talks about judicial overreach. Just a year ago, she was asking the courts to enumerate more rights for people. Albertans deserve a little bit of consistency in the people that we call our leaders. One of the challenges this government has, Madam Speaker, is that it's not particularly interested in governing. It's interested in scoring points. It's interested in moving forward from whatever they happen to see on tweets, as the Premier says she gets most of her information, or right-wing podcasts. Albertans deserve better than the Campus Republican Club. They deserve a government that is here to govern and govern consistently and live by the rights that they themselves say that they believe in. So, the Premier, it's interesting that the member opposite says this is terrible because this entire speech is reading the Premier's words. So if you think they're terrible, perhaps bring them up with the Premier. Let's keep reading. Let's keep going. One of these is that rights endowed by each of us by the virtue of being human. They are not rights that are granted by this legislature. They are granted by virtue of being human. They are inalienable, and they don't get suspended. They don't get suspended in times of emergency. Rights being inalienable exist at all times. I can see that the member opposite doesn't believe that he believes that his own voice is more important, but I'd be interested for him to stand up and defend this legislation and tell us if he believes that rights are inalienable, that if rights are granted by the Creator. And if you do believe that, Madam Speaker, it means that you do not believe that human beings have the right to take away other human beings' rights.
Honourable member, I hesitate to interrupt.
The Premier...
It would be most appropriate to direct your comments through the chair.
I thought I said, Madam Speaker, did I not?
That's not...
Just keep stopping me, Madam Speaker. I'm still new at this. I appreciate it. Thank you. So, the Premier further goes on to say, we want to make sure that every person is able to talk to their doctor, talk to their medical professional, and be able to get the advice that makes the most sense for them. Now, I want to stop here for a moment, if I may, because the Minister of Justice, in introducing this bill, said something that really struck me. He said, this is about the right and the role of parents. He said, remember that these are parents making the decisions. This is actually a critical point. And it is, in fact, one of the arguments that the government used, that this is, in fact, about parental rights. But let's be very, very clear. And this is what the minister perhaps obfuscated in his remarks, Madam Speaker. Right now, no person under the age of 18, with very, very tiny exceptions for emancipated minors, can get these medical services without parental consent.
That's right.
The minister went on and on and on about, oh, kids can't vote, why should they be able to consent to medical procedures? That's just not true. They need parental consent to do any of this, and their physician has to recommend it. And you will have seen, I hope, a letter that was posted today, and I will find it in a moment, from the Canadian Pediatric Society, excuse me, and perhaps I will share it with you. Premier Smith, writes Dr. Wong and Dr. Thakore. You're allowed to read other people's names.
Honourable member, I may clarify.
I'm sorry. Thank you for that catch. Premier, The Canadian Pediatric Society is gravely concerned about the Government of Alberta's use of the Notwithstanding Clause in amending legislation that will ban or significantly reduce access to care and supports for the transgender and gender-diverse children and youth of Alberta. Invoking the Notwithstanding Clause to circumvent constitutional challenges to legislative amendments that will prohibit gender-affirming care for minors, restrict students' use of chosen names and pronouns, and ban the participation of transgender women and girls in sports is a dangerous precedent that will lead to significant negative health outcomes. Gender-affirming medical care for youth should be a personal and informed decision between the patient, their parents, and their medical team. These laws will reduce access and choice in healthcare and represent government intrusion in the patient-physician relationship. All laws, but particularly those with the potential to have such immediate and direct impacts on the health and safety of young people, should be guided by the best available evidence and prioritize upholding fundamental rights and freedoms. Using the notwithstanding clause to limit the charter protections of TGD children and youth who already face significant marginalization and discrimination is political interference that will erode the health and well-being of some of Alberta's most vulnerable. As such, we strongly urge you to revoke the use of the notwithstanding clause and ensure that the Government of Alberta upholds and protects the Charter's rights and freedoms and the Alberta Bill of Rights. We're going to talk a lot more shortly about the Alberta Bill of Rights as well. But the point here is that contrary to what the minister said, these bills, as they did last year, as they do now, fundamentally take away parents' rights. So if, Madam Speaker, you were to be in a room with your child, I actually don't know if you're a parent, so I will speak the generally you. If a parent is in the room, in the examination room with their child, and the physician says, this is the best treatment, this is the scientific treatment, we've gone through all the tests, this is what we think you should have, but I'm sorry to tell you that the government will not allow you to have that treatment. It's not giving parents rights, it's taking them away. It's inserting the Premier and the Ministers of Health, all four of them, into the diagnostic room with the patient, the parent, and their physician. How could that possibly be construed as giving parents more rights? If the minister truly believed, as he said, that the parents are the most important caregiver, why would he strip away these rights from parents? Because that's not what this is about, Madam Speaker. This isn't about safety. It isn't about helping anybody. It's not about something that people are desperately calling for in the community. This is about politics, pure and simple. This is about campus Republican politics, folks who do not realize that the world has moved forward, moved on from those campus Republican politics, as we've seen in election after election after election in the last year or so. And this is what this government is about. You know, I heard the minister say for the very first time today, I've never heard the government say this before on this issue, that this is about real people and real problems, because they sure have not been acting as though there are people involved in all of this. They talk broadly about parental rights and freedoms and so on, not talking about the freedoms that they are stripping away from every single individual, Madam Speaker. This is what this is really about. This is not a dry conversation in this chamber about the theory of the notwithstanding clause. Don't worry, I will get there. But it's about real people. And it's about saying to real people, you are less. You are lesser. And by the way, Madam Speaker, you'd be interested to know, I think, about the majority of conversations I've had with parents recently. They are from parents who actually supported these bills when they went through last year, particularly the ban on trans women in sports. And this is what they now say. Wait a minute. This government bill means my daughter has to now prove her sex to try out for the school volleyball team. Not the boys, just the girls. And they say, so a law that was sold as protecting my daughter, as protecting my kid, is now a law that assumes my kid is a liar from day one, that forces my kid to humiliate herself and prove her sex. That is not what we were trying to do here when we said we were protecting children. So I have to say, Madam Speaker, if we want to bring politics into it, this government has made a terrible mistake. I said 2 weeks ago, Monday, that this government will rue the day they first used the notwithstanding clause as the day that was the beginning of the end for this government. And this is continuing now. Because the government has skated free of this stuff for so long. So let's just start with the fact that we have a premier who has a history of violating people's rights from the moment she took power. Let's not forget that this premier was called out by the Ethics Commissioner. Quote, Premier Smith contravened Section 3 of the Conflicts of Interest Act in her interaction with the Minister of Justice and Attorney General in relation to criminal charges. Because remember, this premier thought that she had the powers of an American governor. She thought she could pardon people. She thought that she could tell Crown prosecutors what to do, and she became, I believe, the first premier to be called out by the Ethics Commissioner for this work. Because again, she was listening to the campus Republicans. In this particular case, she was listening to our classmate. The Premier and I both went to school with this guy. He was my debating partner, believe it or not, a fellow called Ezra Levant. And her office had, in fact, written a memo in which she said, quote, "In preparing this proposal, I would like you to delineate between individuals charged with criminal code offences that include violence and weapons and are for contempt of court from those involving alleged mischief, violations of provincial health orders, or, minor offences." And the Ethics Commissioner slapped her on the wrist because the Premier had forgotten that in our system, the courts are independent. Independent judges, this is Nigel Banks, Professor Nigel Banks writing, independent judges, not politicians, decide the constitutionality of laws, that professional law enforcement, not politicians, decide how and when to enforce the laws duly passed by legislatures, and that independent prosecutors, not politicians, decide who to prosecute or not prosecute. The Premier has walked over this line so many times. And no matter what, it's still wrong.
Yes.
But now, she's found a get-out-of-jail card. Maybe she can walk over that line that she has desperately wanted to walk over for so very long, simply by saying, well, we can use Section 33. Now, here's something interesting. Let's go way back. Let's go back to January 14th, 2006. The Premier at that time, wrote, "The notwithstanding clause is simply not necessary," unquote. That was when she believed in human rights. But we don't have to go that far back. Let's go back 11 months. Let's go back 11 months to when the Premier was asked, why did you pass these terrible laws without the notwithstanding clause? And she said, quote, "I don't want to prejudge the court. We will put forward a robust case that this legislation is reasonable in a free democratic society, that it's evidence-based, and that we're protecting children and their right to be able to make adult decisions as adults," unquote. So she said she wasn't going to use the notwithstanding clause. That was 11 months ago. What has changed? Does she no longer believe that the legislation is reasonable? Does she no longer believe that it makes sense in a free democratic society? Does she no longer believe that it's evidence-based? Does she no longer believe that it protects children? One of those things has to be true, if not all of them. Because if none of those things are true, if the Minister of Justice could not stand up and say why those things that were true a year ago are no longer true, that means we're only doing this for politics. It means that we're not doing it because we fundamentally still believe in this legislation. That means the Premier is now the first and second Premier in Alberta's history to knowingly pass legislation she knows is unconstitutional. That should shock everybody, particularly from someone who says she's the most freedom-loving politician in the history of the universe. Really, no one is joining in with that member. He really ought to try something new or perhaps wait until his time. So, all that said, and unfortunately, unlike the members opposite, he can't get under my skin, so I'm keeping going. So, let's talk about a tweet just today from the Minister of Justice. Minister of Justice said today, "In December 2024, we passed legislation to protect the choices of children and youth." So let's stop there. The legislation, well, once again, Madam Speaker, the minister opposite is chirping, but he's chirping at his own minister's thoughts. I'm just reading the minister's tweet, Madam Speaker. So perhaps the chirper over there might think about his chirping. So, in December 2024, we passed legislation to protect the choices of children and youth. So I would love to know how exactly this legislation is protecting the choices of children and youth when, in fact, it's taking choices away from children and youth. When the Premier was asked, given that the way the legislation is written on the pronoun legislation, it will lead to the forced outing of children who want to change their pronouns without their consent. In fact, the Premier, before introducing the legislation, said on a number of occasions, no one will be forcibly outed The parents will only be notified with the child's consent. That's not what's in the legislation. If a child talks to a teacher and the teacher conforms with the legislation, it starts a never-ending train whose destination is the outing of that child to the parents with or without the child's consent.
Shame.
And this is a problem for a number of reasons, but it's particularly a problem because the government said they didn't want to do that. And when the Premier was asked, she said, no, 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 children still have a choice. Their choice is to tell their parents or stay in the closet. Yeah. So the gall of this Justice Minister to say that the legislation protects their choices. Yeah. All this legislation does is take away choices. Whether you like those choices or not, whether you agree with those choices or not, one has to say, do I believe that people have the freedom of choice? And yet the minister has the gall to say that this legislation protects the choices of children when, in fact, it takes them all away. The minister then says that the legislation is to improve access to health services. The word salad in this is remarkable. Whoever wrote this, because, of course, there's nothing in the legislation about access to health services. The only thing in the legislation about access to health services is indeed the fact that we are taking away particular health services from particular groups of people. How the minister justifies in his head that that somehow improves access to health services is a puzzle I am unable to solve. And then it says, support families in being involved. And of course, we've learned very clearly that this takes away parental choice and it takes away parental right. So how does it support families in being more involved when, in fact, it takes away something that they used to have the ability of parents to consent to? It goes on. The minister then writes, now, some activist groups, including ones from outside Alberta, are asking the courts to overturn these laws. This is the government's latest thing. Anyone who disagrees with them, any citizen who disagrees with them, they don't believe in their freedom of speech. They don't defend their right to say what you want. They don't say things like the Premier used to say, which is, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Instead, they demonize people. So folks like the folks in the gallery and the folks walking at home, they're just normal people. And we're going to hear a lot from them in a few minutes when I start telling you about some of the things they have to say. And he calls them activist groups, including some from outside Alberta. This is the same government that has lashed out angrily against the people behind the recall petitions. This is the same government that suggests that those are somehow controlled by evil union thugs. This is the same government where the Premier compared grandmas going door to door in Bowness to militants trying to overthrow her legitimate government. This kind of demonization is dangerous. And for a Premier who believes in freedom of speech and freedom of expression to use the power of government and the power of this office to demonize opponents and to tell them that they're wrong and to say that they're outsiders or they're activists, they're just people. And our entire job, our entire life here is based on people. It's on supporting citizens whether they agree with us or not and helping them live better lives. So the minister further goes on to say, we want to keep the focus on where it belongs, on the health, safety, and well-being of Alberta's children. Let's clap for that, folks. I could not agree more. But of course, this government has done nothing to help Alberta's children. 1/3 of Calgary households rely on the food bank. Public education is an absolute shambles, as we've heard over and over and over again. This government is looking to strip away services from children whose families are not yet citizens of Canada. And this government consistently is making children less safe. Let's not forget where all this college Republican stuff came from. This government a year ago, almost 2 years ago now, did polling. They did focus groups to try and figure out which vulnerable group was the least popular, which vulnerable group had no political support so that they could say that they're big and tough and they're going after people. And this government chose children with an outsized risk of self-harm and suicide. And rather than sitting down and saying to parents, look, we understand that you're worried about the changing world, you're worried about your kids, let's think about how we can help you, the government used a one-size-fits-all deal. Because here's the thing. The vast majority of children going through this, their parents know. Their supportive parents know very well. But for a small minority of children who don't know how to approach their parents, who are scared about approaching their parents, who are nervous about approaching their parents, this government is now forcibly outing them. That's what the legislation they did. And as always, this government passes ideological legislation without a thought as to how it impacts real people or how it will be implemented. Getting back to the trans women in sports, right? What we're hearing over and over again is that parents didn't think it meant that every single girl is now suspected of not being a girl. And once again, this government goes through this kind of abuse over and over and over. So 3 weeks ago, the government took the unprecedented step of using the notwithstanding clause against workers. And I want to read some reaction that people across the political spectrum and across the community had to the government doing that. The Canadian Bar Association, quote, "This government has invoked the notwithstanding clause before the court has had an opportunity to examine the law and determine whether it constitutes a reasonable limit." Because remember, the Constitution does allow for reasonable limits. By doing so, they're seeking to remove the judicial branch from the democratic lawmaking process. If the notwithstanding clause is to be invoked, it should only be used as a tool of last resort after the courts have had a chance to examine the legislation. The preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause cannot be allowed to normalize. Neither should the curtailment of legislative debate become routine. Overuse of these extraordinary measures, especially when coupled with provisions that also set aside the Alberta Bill of Rights and the Alberta Human Rights Act, risks undermining the constitutional and human rights architecture that protects all Albertans. We cannot take the rule of law for granted. If we do, it may not be there to protect our rights when we most need them. The law firm McLennan Ross draws a parallel to Quebec's Bill 21, the bill that this government and this Justice Minister has defended in front of the Supreme Court. Quebec's Bill 21 contains a provision through which Quebec exercised the override power, pursuant to Section 33 of the Charter, to apply Bill 21 notwithstanding certain rights and freedoms. Can we remind ourselves what Bill 21 is? Bill 21 is, I believe, the only law in the world that restricts certain jobs from people of certain faiths. That says to Muslim women and observant Sikh men and observant Jewish men that you cannot work in certain jobs in the public service simply because of your religion, for no other reason. And this law, of course, was defended by this Justice Minister and this provincial government before the Supreme Court. I understand earlier today there was a discussion about what the Canadian Civil Liberties Association had to say about it. But perhaps we can requote them. The Alberta government's decision to invoke the notwithstanding clause to order teachers back to work marks a deeply troubling moment for our democracy. If Alberta can use the notwithstanding clause now without consequence, it will not hesitate to do so again. Oh, that was prophetic. That was written 2 weeks ago. As will other governments. Each new use of the notwithstanding clause normalizes an abuse of power that weakens Canada's democracy. When governments use the notwithstanding clause to dodge accountability and silence opposition, they don't just target workers, they target the rights of everyone in Canada. Calgary's Criminal Defence Lawyers Association. If it's actually that we expect that we are going to intrude on all of these rights, then the legislation becomes all the more draconian. Amnesty International. We made international news, friends. Alberta's use of the notwithstanding clause continues an alarming trend of provincial governments putting political expediency ahead of people's human rights. An attack on their rights is an attack on us all. Perhaps the one that touched me the most, as a person of faith, I've been asking myself, how do you reconcile this with faith? How do you reconcile this if you're someone who believes that every human being is created perfect by God? That every blade of grass created by God is perfect? How do you reconcile taking rights away from people? And I've been thinking hard on that question. And it was interesting to see what Bishop Stephen London, the Archbishop of Edmonton, had to say about this. And I think I would recommend everyone, particularly people who think of themselves as people of faith, to listen closely to what the Archbishop had to say. Quote, "The deeper implications of this action are sobering because when one fundamental freedom is denied, it is possible to imagine other fundamental freedoms being denied, including our own freedom of conscience and religion." Remember, that was the very first thing that the Premier spoke about in her maiden speech. "In a time when democratic institutions around the world are becoming fragile, I believe it would be wise to step back from this action." Unquote. Never heard of an Anglican archbishop reaching out into politics like that, but I've heard from faith community leaders across the spectrum talking about how dangerous this is for people of faith. And we'll finish off with parents, because the Justice Minister is fond about talking about parents. Let's listen to a parents group here. "We are deeply alarmed by reports that the Government of Alberta intends to invoke the Charter's notwithstanding clause to enforce legislation restricting the rights and well-being of transgender youth and adults. This clause was designed for extraordinary circumstances, not as a political tool to override fundamental freedoms. Using it in this way sends a chilling message. Dignity and equality can be set aside for political purposes. These are not abstract policy debates. These are young lives. Transgender youth are not mistakes. They're not political talking points. They're human beings, deserving of affirmation, support, and the opportunity to thrive. And yet, we have a government that uses these children, these vulnerable children, as nothing but an opportunity to score political points. So, I've heard another name of a former member of this legislature used on the other side quite a bit, the name of Peter Naheed. Madam Speaker, I'm not one to whine, but I do believe that the Speaker has often said, if you have something to say, say it. If you're going to heckle, heckle. But if you're just going to ramble, quit rambling. And I would ask you to enforce that against that member opposite who can't seem to stop himself. But let's talk about Peter Naheed. No, let's talk. The member opposite doesn't want to talk about Peter Naheed.
I can appreciate that you are frustrated by various noises in this chamber. However, I'm not having a hard time hearing you and the words you have to say. Given that, all members are expected to treat each other with respect in this chamber as the debate continues, and we'll keep that in mind as we go ahead.
I appreciate that, Madam Speaker. Thank you. I do want to talk a lot about Peter Naheed. Peter Naheed was a professor at the University of Calgary. He famously taught a course that the Premier and I were both in at the same time. And, one of us was paying attention. But we talked a lot in that class about the notwithstanding clause. Peter Naheed, of course, was one of the architects of the notwithstanding clause. And in 1991, on the 10th anniversary of that clause, he gave the first Marv Leach Memorial Lecture. And it was about the notwithstanding clause. And it's worth reflecting in some detail on what he had to say. It was reprinted some years later by the Canadian Centre for Constitutional Studies at the University of Alberta. And the head of that centre, David Schneiderman, wrote a bit of an introduction to Mr. Naheed's speech. And he says, "We learned a number of important lessons from Peter Naheed's lecture. First, the legislative override, the notwithstanding clause, was intended to be used only in those rare instances where the legislature was in disagreement with judicial interpretation regarding major matters of public policy." And so then Peter Naheed did talk a little bit about labour rights and the instances in which he might use the clause should the Supreme Court rule in a certain way. As it turns out, the Supreme Court did not rule in that way. And he did not use the clause because he felt that it was not to be used because it was to be used so rarely. And he explained why he advocated for the notwithstanding clause. It's a long story, but I will fill you in on some of it. So it actually comes from the fact that Prime Minister Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights had a notwithstanding clause in it. And the Alberta Bill of Rights, when it was first imposed, the members opposite may recall that they too amended that Bill of Rights just in the last session or two, so they should be very familiar with it, also included a notwithstanding clause. Here's an interesting stat for you. The notwithstanding clause on the Alberta Bill of Rights has never, ever been used until this government used it. And Premier Naheed really pointed out what he was aiming at when he talked about how important the notwithstanding clause was. He talked a lot about the example of the Supreme Court in the United States. And he said the Supreme Court in the United States for a long time, up to, including, and beyond the Civil War, was arguing that certain people did not have the same rights as certain other people. And it was very difficult, for example, to end slavery because of the Dred Scott decision, because of various things that that Supreme Court had done. So in his mind, the notwithstanding clause should be used to prevent judicial overreach in the opposite direction than this government intimates. In fact, it was meant to be stop the judiciary from not adapting to the times, something that the Premier just a year ago suggested was a good thing that needed to happen. But the most important part of all of this is he defended fiercely the notwithstanding clause, the use of it. He talked about why it was there. But then he said, but there are 3 amendments that must be made, because you can't just use the notwithstanding clause at will. And let's remember that Mr. Naheed never, ever used it. And because he never used it because he passed constitutional legislation. It's not that hard. And so he suggested that there were 3 amendments that had to be made. Number 1, if a notwithstanding clause is used, the legislature or parliament should be required to spell out the purposes of the legislation as suggested by the Macdonald Royal Commission. Thus, Section 33 should be amended to disallow, as Quebec has done, standard form overrides. The legislation before us today is the key example of what he meant by a standard form override. So Mr. Naheed would have said you should not ever have to do that. You have to spell out in the legislation why you feel this is needed. Number 2, a simple majority does not appear adequate for Parliament or a provincial legislature to introduce legislation including a notwithstanding clause. It is too substantive an action by the elected body, and hence requires a higher degree of authorization than a simple majority. I agree with the federal government's constitutional proposals of September 1991, it's the beginning of the Meech Lake Accord if people remember, that the votes necessary to Parliament or a provincial legislature to invoke the override clause of the Charter be changed from a simple majority to some higher number, he suggests 60%, of the members of Parliament or the provincial legislature. The third element that he asked for is perhaps the most important. The approach used by the Saskatchewan government in 1986 in the Saskatchewan Labour Relations Act, so in other words, exactly what this government did, preempting judicial review in advance be disallowed. In my mind, says Mr. Naheed, such an action is undemocratic in that the purpose of Section 33 was ultimate supremacy of Parliament over the judiciary, not dominion over or exclusion of the judiciary's role in interpreting the relevant sections of the Charter of Rights. You know who agrees with that, Mr. Speaker? Or who agreed with it as recently as 10 months ago, in fact? Who perhaps agreed with it as recently as 1 week ago? The Premier of Alberta. The Premier of Alberta has said several times that she believes that the courts should have the final say. She said it about the Sovereignty Act, she said it about this legislation, and as recently as a week ago, she said, I want the courts to have the time to figure this out. So again, Mr. Speaker, I ask one more time, why are we here? We're solving a problem that doesn't exist with a tool that shouldn't be used by a government desperate to change the channel. That's it. And frankly, the passing of this law will have no impact on this draconian legislation and on the fact that it is already in place. It will have no impact on the fact that every girl over the age of 12 is now a suspect. that every girl over the age of 12 has to go through the humiliating process of proving her sex in order to play volleyball. It doesn't change the fact that we are trying hard to restrict, not add, access to care. These are the issues that we really need to understand are happening here. And perhaps I can quote a professor from the University of Alberta. Many of us have read his commentary, Dr. Jared Wesley. And Dr. Wesley says very clearly that the Charter requires legislatures, not just premiers, to decide whether to remove our rights. He says the Charter allows courts, not just cabinets, to weigh in on rights issues. The UCP's preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause eliminates all judicial scrutiny. And here's the funny thing, Mr. Speaker. I actually disagree with Dr. Wesley here because it doesn't. The court has shown in its work on the Saskatchewan bill, the Saskatchewan anti-trans bill, that they are very willing to comment on whether they feel the bill is unconstitutional or not, regardless of the fact that Saskatchewan used the Human Rights Act. So the Premier's get-out-of-jail-free clause is not even helping her here. This court will still rule on this law. And it's very clear, despite what she said a year ago, that she thought that it was reasonable in a free democratic society, that it was evidence-based, and that it was about protecting children and adults. It's very clear she's scared of that ruling. But guess what? She's going to get that ruling anyway. Dr. Wesley goes on to say, when a government reaches for Section 33 preemptively in an ordinary policy dispute, it sends a signal. The political cost of overriding rights is lower than the cost of justifying limits on those rights in court. I don't believe that, Mr. Speaker, but that is clearly the political calculation that the Minister and the Premier have done. Dr. Wesley goes on to say the Charter created not just individual rights and freedoms, but civic obligations. It rests on a simple compact. The compact that governments will act within constitutional bounds. The compact that legislatures will hold them accountable. That courts will review these actions when asked, and that citizens will keep politicians in line through pressure and elections. So listen, this government has knowingly acted outside of constitutional bounds for the first time in Alberta history. They rammed through their first piece of legislation with rules unprecedented in the history of Alberta to prevent the legislature from holding them accountable. They believe that passing this legislation will keep the courts from reviewing their actions. It won't. But the thing that they have forgotten about is the last piece from Dr. Wesley, that citizens will keep politicians in line. And it's the citizens, regardless of the contempt with which this government treats them, that will keep this government in line. Since 2 weeks ago, fully 1/3 of my colleagues opposite, and more to come, find themselves the subject of recall petitions. And they can demonize it. They can say, oh, it's the union thugs doing it. Oh, it's all organized. Oh, my goodness, it's the members opposite doing it. I wish I had that kind of power. But, and so does the Premier, clearly, but these are citizens. These are everyday citizens, and as much contempt as the people opposite. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I think my colleague is rising.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise pursuant to Section 13(4), which states when a member is speaking, no person shall pass between that member and the chair or interrupt that member except to raise a point of order. For last half hour, that members over there, government members, have been continuously trying to interrupt the leader of the official opposition, and they have not raised a point of order. So I would urge you to call them to order and let the member speak, because floor is members and he is speaking, and nobody should be interfering while he is speaking.
Thank you, Honourable Member. The Deputy Government House Leader.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition has been speaking for probably a good hour at this point. There have been no points of order raised by anybody in relation to any of the discussions that's happening. Members on both sides of the Assembly are engaged in chatter with one another. Nobody is deliberately walking in front of the member or interrupting that member, and I would say that this is really not a point of order. It's up to you to make that determination. If you hear that the chatter is too loud for the member to be heard, but I'm sitting here, I can hear him quite well.
Well, let me just say this. Well, I don't think this is a point of order. The opposition House Leader, or Deputy House Leader, forgive me, is not wrong. And as is always the case in this chamber, when one person has the floor, that should be the only person's voice that we hear. And if other members have things to say, they should leave the room to the appointed places and say them, or resist the urge to interrupt and to speak. That is the standard, not just today, but every day. And with all due respect, how longer the honourable member is speaking is not the point. Anybody who's recognized in this place and has the floor should expect silence the whole time. I know it doesn't always happen, but it ought to always happen. So the Deputy Opposition House Leader is correct to complain about that, and let's do better. Please carry on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So I've just taken the House through a long treatise here on the use of the notwithstanding clause and explained why I believe that their use of the notwithstanding clause is inappropriate. It is not in the element of the folks who wrote it in the first place, and it infringes deeply on people's human rights. But earlier, the Minister of Justice said, we're talking about real people. And so I think it's now time to hear from real people. And I would like to share with this House a number of things we've heard from real people. So let's start with Brett from Calgary. As a parent of a transgender child, the sheer audacity to strip my child and my family of our charter freedoms just to score political points is appalling. Do not do this. John from Calgary writes, I write to you once again as the parent of a trans child, urging you to rethink the legislation regarding gender-affirming care. My daughter is now in her early 20s, and I have witnessed her struggles as a boy from around age 8. Especially during her teenage years, there was an ongoing development of mental health struggles because of a human being not feeling at home in her own body, leading to deep depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and eventually suicidal thoughts. She's been through counseling. She's talked to a variety of healthcare providers, yet the situation did not improve until there was access to gender-affirming care. She's now changing into a happy and active member of society, and she holds a steady job. This has only been made possible due to the fact that she's finally getting the care and support she so deserves and is able to live the life she wants as a trans woman. Based on my experience over the last 10 years, I don't know if she would still be alive without the necessary support she has been and currently still is receiving. Tammy writes, I am an Albertan with a transgender daughter, and I want you to know and understand how much your government's plan to use the notwithstanding clause to override the charter rights of two-spirit, trans, and gender-diverse Albertans will hurt these communities and the family and friends who support and love them. These laws deliberately target trans youth. They cause stigma, exclusion, and serious mental harm. I would love to sit down with you and my daughter so you could hear her story and you could see what a wonderful human being she is, in no small way, because she was able to get gender-affirming care she needed before your government imposed these bans for political gain. I fear for young people who will have this right stripped away from them. I fear they will be forced to leave. I fear they will harm themselves because they can't see a way out. I often hear about parents' rights in this issue, their rights to have a say in their child's school and health care. These laws take away my parental rights. They take away a parent's right to advocate for their child and get them the health care that they are entitled to. Gender-affirming care is supported by the Canadian Medical Association and every major health group. It saves lives. Tavina from Bragg Creek writes, "It violates Canadian values and puts my daughter's life at risk for political gain. Such an action is cruel and unworthy of Alberta. Gender identity is protected under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Life-saving gender-affirming care is supported by the Canadian Medical Association. I am very concerned about my daughter's mental health in the face of brutal discrimination." As a parent yourself, she's writing to the Premier, as a stepmother yourself, maybe you can imagine a parent's panic and alarm in a circumstance like this. Families, not politicians, should make healthcare decisions in consultation with doctors. Using the notwithstanding clause to ban gender-affirming care silences courts, overrides rights, and is a gross abuse of power. Kim from Brooks Medicine Hat constituency writes, "I'm a parent of a trans daughter. I have sat across from you," she's writing to the Premier, "and told our story and felt completely not listened to. You came to our appointment to debate with parents of a trans kid, not to hear our concerns and learn how marginalized kids would be affected. You came to tell us how we and the medical community are wrong." Again, treating citizens that disagree with this government with such utter contempt. I oppose this plan because hundreds of provincial medical associations, including the Canadian Medical Association and Pediatric Medical Associations, all the social work, mental health, human rights, law associations have all spoken out against this. Advocates, parents, allies, and trans people themselves have been screaming the truth, just trying to get you to hear, but you will not listen. I oppose this plan because I know the Albertans playing political games for clout. You are playing these games with children. I oppose this plan because don't Albertans deserve medical freedom? You fought so hard for the anti-vaxxers to be free from control, but won't allow parents and kids access to approved and regulated medication and therapies within Canada and Alberta. Elizabeth from Calgary writes, "I'm writing to express my very strong objection to the contents of Bill 26 and the prospect that this bill will be enforced through the invocation of Section 33 when Bill 9 is introduced this session. I'm the parent of a brilliant, talented, and kind transgender child. At 15, Alberta law traditionally would give them the power to make their own healthcare decisions. In addition, they have two parents who are fully supportive of their desire to produce evidence-based gender-affirming care and a team of world-class health specialists ready to administer that care at the Alberta Children's Hospital. My child will be directly harmed by the contents of Bill 26, and it is no exaggeration to say that their life will be put at risk. I'm a parent, and your government claims to care about parental rights. But Bill 26 violates my parental rights to seek the best evidence-based medical care for my own child. I'm pleading with you and your government to repeal Bill 26 and return medical decision-making powers to Alberta's parents and their children where they belong. Michael from Calgary writes, I'm writing to you today as the proud father of a transgender person. I am deeply alarmed by our government's plans to invoke the notwithstanding clause to strip away even more of the limited rights and freedoms that part of our community still has. Living as a transgender individual involves challenges that few can truly understand. I urge you not to proceed with this action, if only to preserve the compassion and sense of justice that all Albertans deserve. Gender-affirming care saves lives. It should be guided by doctors, not politicians. Overriding the Charter to take away healthcare and equality rights is wrong. Please do not ban gender-affirming care. Naomi writes from Ponoka. I live in Ponoka, one of the most conservative regions in our province. My son is transgender and came out to me at 16 years old after a suicide attempt. He had struggled silently for years, as he didn't want it to be true. And he knew that life would be difficult, especially in Alberta. How sad is that? I knew he was struggling with something, and I had him in regular therapy in addition to antidepressants, which didn't work because they didn't address the problem. And admittedly, when he came out to me, I didn't want it to be true either, for the same reason. So I buckled down and did actual research, studying the science conducted by world-renowned neuroscientists, and quickly discovered that the treatment for my son was hormone therapy. There's no question, that's the treatment. How much, when to start, what needs to happen for a proper diagnosis. Sure, all of that deserves further resources to get to the best possible science. But taking away all of the existing limited resources for families is working against that goal. Trans people have existed for at least as long as humans have a recorded history. And they're not going to magically disappear because the government of Alberta denies them health care. I had always, in theory, supported the 2S LGBTQ+ community and the individual rights of every human being guaranteed through our Charter of Rights. But I had never before faced a personal attack by my government, fueled not by science, but by the ideological beliefs of a vocal minority. This was all happening at the time that our MLA candidate was talking about trans kids in schools being like poop in a batch of cookie dough. By the way, I believe in their individual rights to speak, by the way, because those voices should definitely not supersede our Charter of Rights. If you really think deeply about it, it is so clear that using the notwithstanding clause to override the rights of a tiny, vulnerable population in critical need of health care is completely opposed to the purpose of the Charter to begin with. It is truly anti-Canadian to think otherwise. If you'd like me to send you the science, please let me know. In the meantime, do not invoke the notwithstanding clause simply to further political goals. This is real life for actual human beings. So that's just a sampling of things that we've heard from parents. Think about what those parents are saying. I didn't want this for my kid. I didn't push this on my kid. I am so worried for my kid. How are they going to be able to succeed? How are they going to be able to thrive? But as a parent, I have to do what's right for my child. And this government is taking away parents' rights to do what is right for their children. Let's hear from some trans people. Rain from Edmonton writes, as a transgender individual myself who has grown up in Alberta all my life, I know exactly what it's like to be a trans youth, and I know exactly what it's like to be trans in Alberta right now. If I did not have access to gender-affirming health care, I don't think I'd be alive today. When I was a teenager, I knew 100% that I was trans and I would never be myself if I could not transition. However, when you're a trans minor, there's many, many steps you have to take with your medical providers before starting any form of gender-affirming care. First, they always make sure you're making the decision that benefits you and your body the most. Whether that be hormone blockers, 100% reversible, or starting hormone replacement therapy as soon as you're able after waiting for an insane amount of time on a wait list and undergoing dozens of tests. No one is forcing minors into anything, as no one wants to go through rigorous medical inspection for years just to feel like a human being. Additionally, minors do not undergo gender-affirming surgery. I had to wait until I was over 18 and undergoing hormone replacement therapy for at least a year to prove my decision was valid. And yet you want to make this process even harder by taking it away completely. James from Edmonton writes, I'm writing you as a concerned Albertan and a transgender individual who has faced significant barriers in our province due to systemic discrimination. As someone deeply invested in the well-being of our community, particularly our youth, I urge you to reconsider the recent legislation introduced by your government targeting transgender youth. These policies are not only harmful, but will exacerbate the mental health crisis among trans youth. Research clearly demonstrates that such anti-trans laws lead to devastating outcomes for young people. A peer-reviewed study analyzing data from over 61,000 transgender and non-binary youth found that states enacting these restrictions saw suicide attempts increase by up to 72% among affected teens. This is a government that continually says they're protecting youth. Yet we know from evidence that the laws they're passing hurt youth. In Canada, where similar policies are unfolding, trans youth already face suicide attempts as high as 30%, far exceeding the general population. These laws do not protect children, they isolate them, driving up rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm. Denying trans youth the ability to express their identity at school or access necessary care is a direct threat to their lives. Let's go to Lethbridge. Reese writes, limiting people's access to life-saving care is unacceptable. The limiting of access to health care will always affect everyone. Attacking marginalized groups is always a distraction of what's truly important. These efforts would be much more well spent helping the unhoused. Oh, I could give a longer list than that. I'm proudly transgender and I've been on hormones for 10 months. I can personally speak to how gender-affirming care is vital and life-saving. I have met the Premier. It is heart-wrenching to know someone I have met face-to-face, shook hands with, is now taking away the rights of my transgender siblings. We will never stop showing up for trans youth. Trans is beautiful, gender-affirming care is beautiful, protect trans youth always. Once the stripping of rights has started, it will never stop. Kelly writes, Dear Premier, I'm from a family who has voted Conservative for generations, partly because of the value your party placed on personal freedom. This is a value I've heard you espouse over and over, so why the hypocrisy? I strongly oppose your government's reported plan to use the notwithstanding clause to override the charter rights of anyone, including trans Albertans. A government has no business in the matters of someone's personal identity and certainly no business overriding doctors on matters of health care. Be the person you say you are, the one who values freedom. John writes, I'd like to see the government leave this subject alone. Stay out of the medical choices that are personal and private. Transgender people fuel this world's creativity and they keep us open and thinking. When you prohibit their authenticity, energy, and love, you rot the province of its fruits. Trans people live their life in a different approach that others might not accept. And when we out them to parents due to the law, we risk abuse, death, and an increased homeless population. Furthermore, this act seeks to divide rather than unite. This act harms the child by providing them no other option but to hide and suppress themselves even further. It's already hard to exist and to coexist. Do not make it harder for trans youth to coexist even within themselves. Charlie from Calgary writes, Danielle Smith is misusing the clause to harm a minority community. Targeting youth. Oh, I'm sorry.
Member,
I apologize, Mr. Speaker.
I know you're new here, but you're not quite that new.
I apologize, Mr. Speaker. Skip that part. I'll just say Charlie writes, I started hormone replacement therapy in November of 2024, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I began gaining confidence that was stolen from me because of my body. I started being more comfortable in everyday activities, and it saved my life. In my early teens, I struggled with my mental health, as do approximately 77% of trans youth. The Premier is jeopardizing medical transitioning with this notwithstanding clause. These laws will strip away rights, restrict life-saving health care, and force teachers to out trans youth. I was raised believing Canada was home to the strong and free, and I see now that I was lied to. This discrimination is disgusting. Gender identity is protected in our Human Rights Act, and I can see how the Premier looks towards the U.S. for guidance. In the U.S., after the laws and bans President Trump signed, transgender suicide rates increased by over 70%. Alberta's bill will create the same devastating outcomes here. Is this what I have to look forward to? Seeing my friends, family, and community fear for our health just because of our gender identity? Angel from Airdrie writes, your government has said it may use the notwithstanding clause to shield new laws from charter reviews. This means these laws are not constitutional. If your laws are fair, defend them in court. Do not suspend the Charter of Rights to make them stand. Gender-affirming care is supported by every official Canadian medical body. It is evidence-based, life-saving, and built on decades of medical research. Politicians have no place overruling doctors or silencing the courts. Albertans expect their Premier to uphold the Charter, not avoid it. I urge you to reject any use of the notwithstanding clause and to respect both trans rights and Alberta families. History will remember who defended rights and who turned them off. Do better than this. Addison from Sylvan Lake writes, many of my family, friends, and colleagues are queer/gender non-conforming, and these groups have always been at risk of discrimination in their everyday life, and now you, the government, want to make sure they are discriminated against. As a non-binary person myself, this is a blatant violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that directly impacts my life and the lives of many people I care for. Gray from Calgary writes, I am transgender. I know others who are transgender. We're not who you think we are. We sleep, eat, breathe, and love just the same as you. By pushing for the removal of transgender rights, specifically targeting all vulnerable youth, you endanger the children that you claim to protect. By using the notwithstanding clause for your own personal interest rather than that of your community, you create war and resentment within your own province. Stop making our lives political. Stop trying to eradicate those of us you don't agree with. Stop trying to silence us. Transgender people have always existed and will continue to exist, whether you agree with us or not. We're calling on you to make the right decision. Do not ban gender-affirming care. Leave those decisions to those involved. Just a few more, Mr. Speaker. Jasmine from Edmonton writes, as a transgender woman and a mother of 2 children, I know both from personal experience and from the medical evidence how devastating these laws will be. My own children are not trans, but I want them to grow up in a province where every child is safe, accepted, and supported. Forcing teachers to out kids will destroy trust and put youth at risk of rejection and abuse. Restricting health care that is supported by every major medical organization in Canada will endanger lives and worsen mental health struggles that are already at crisis levels. Even with the notwithstanding clause, you cannot silence trans people or our allies. This move may block court challenges for 5 years, but it will not erase our voices. We will continue to speak, to organize, and to push back. Public outrage and moral leadership can still force governments to reverse harmful laws, and history shows that unjust laws might stand forever. I urge you to withdraw this plan. Alberta should not be remembered for cruelty and division, but for compassion, fairness, and dignity. Families, not politicians, should be making healthcare decisions with their doctors. Every child deserves to feel safe at school and supported in their healthcare. I'm asking you to do what's right. Step back from this harmful path. Protect kids instead of targeting them. Now, we've heard a lot from real people, as the minister has suggested. Those are a lot of real people who are engaged in the trans community, trans people, parents of trans children. We've also received hundreds of letters from concerned citizens who are not engaged in the community, who are still troubled by what this government is trying to do. Let's go to Lucy from Lethbridge. Premier, this legislation is your government's choice. It is not inevitable or just politics. By introducing these bills, your government is choosing to remove rights, restrict care, and create fear among youth and their families. These actions undermine the safety and dignity of young people across Alberta. Using the notwithstanding clause to silence the courts and override fundamental rights is an abuse of power. This clause was never meant to be a tool for shutting down debate. or shielding harmful laws from court challenge, as Mr. Naheed reminded us. History will remember leaders who weaponize the Constitution to target vulnerable communities. I urge you, Premier, and all members of the Legislative Assembly to withdraw this legislation immediately and to end the use of the notwithstanding clause to silence the courts and Albertans. You cannot erase voices or deny their right to exist safely and with dignity. Families, not politicians, should make healthcare decisions in consultation with doctors. Supporting environments save lives. History will judge the choices made in this moment. Please choose compassion, not cruelty. Robin from Calgary says, the notwithstanding clause is intended for use in emergency situations, and flagrant use of it is a clear overstepping of power and infringement in Alberta's basic rights. Sounds like what the Premier said just a month ago. Sounds like what the Minister of Finance said in introducing Bill 2, when he said, we will not normalize this, we will not make this easy. Yet here we are. The government works for the people of Alberta, and unilaterally making such decisions strips us of our voices. Further, limiting access to health care, simply put, is wrong. Forced outing of trans youth and restricting access to care is dangerous and cruel. Gender-affirming care is supported by the Canadian Medical Association and every other major health group. These laws will do far more harm than good. They will increase alienation, stigma, mental illness, and suicide rates. Here's a different quote. In addition to harming trans youth, these laws pose risk to young girls. By requiring documentation of a child's assigned gender at birth and allowing others to question a child's assigned gender, you open the door to unnecessary harm. Girls who don't meet societal expectations for, quote, what a girl should look or act like, unquote, will have their gender questioned. Emily from Calgary writes, furthermore, the use of the notwithstanding clause cannot be condoned. Overriding charter rights threatens freedoms for every Albertan, not just one community. I am firm in my belief that all Albertans deserve to have the same rights and freedoms upheld, and I will not tolerate actions from this government that will seek to remove them. Jeff from Calgary writes, using the notwithstanding clause to limit the rights of any group undermines the very foundation of our democracy. The Charter exists to protect individuals from government overreach, not to be suspended when it becomes inconvenience. Stripping away rights from marginalized people sets a dangerous precedent that erodes the freedoms of all Albertans. This proposal is not about protecting families or children. It's about taking away autonomy and dignity that people who already face disproportionate discrimination and harm. Every person in this province deserves to live free from fear and interference in their private lives, their identities, and their choices. I feel like members opposite used to say that about medical care, but no longer. History will not look very kindly on leaders who use extraordinary powers to target vulnerable citizens. I urge you to reconsider this course of action and instead leave with compassion, fairness, and respect for the Charter that defines us as Canadians. Albertans deserve a government that protects our rights, not one that selectively removes them. Maybe I'll give you one more. This is Patrick from Edmonton. By stripping these rights from Albertans, you are directly harming our community. Furthermore, your policies are creating a dangerous environment in schools that will lead to forced outings, destroying safe spaces for vulnerable youth. Supportive environments such as safe schools have been proven to reduce suicide attempts among transgender youth by as much as 60%. Premier, have you truly considered the harmful outcomes of your actions? Utilizing the notwithstanding clause to deprive Albertans of their rights is a blatant abuse of power and a gross misapplication of the Canadian Constitution. Invoking this clause before the judicial review process has even begun is a direct affront to our democracy. Geez, the Premier would have said that a month ago. In the recent past, governments, including those here in Alberta, have faced public outrage for misusing the notwithstanding clause. Do you want to be known as a government who disregarded the fundamental rights of your constituents? I urge you to halt this trajectory immediately before Albertans suffer further violations of their human rights. The responsibility to uphold these rights falls squarely on your shoulders. There are lots more, but let me recap. What we have here is a situation where these laws have already been passed. They were wrong then and they're wrong now, but they've already been passed. So we're in a situation now where every girl over the age of 12, not the boys, just the girls, is automatically considered suspect of being not a girl and has to prove her biological sex. We're in a situation now where the government still has not written regulations on gender-affirming care, but very soon, parents and doctors in a treatment room will come to the conclusion that a particular course of treatment is the right course of treatment for their child, but the government will not allow it, where the Premier and the 4 Ministers of Health will be sitting in that diagnostic room with the patient and their parents and their physician. And we're in a situation where children will be outed with or without their consent to their parents because of the way this legislation is written, despite the Premier's protestations that no one will ever be outed against their will. And this is the world we are now in. And so, why are we doing this? One more time, why are we doing this? There is an injunction on the gender-affirming care that wasn't in place anyway yet, because the regulations haven't been written. And maybe passing these laws will remove that injunction. Maybe passing these laws will prevent further waste of time and resources on government lawyers to defend the indefensible. But we don't think any of that will happen. Lawyers will write new briefs, new injunctions will be written, and the Supreme Court has very much signaled that they are going to look at these kinds of cases as they have done in Saskatchewan, whether or not the notwithstanding clause is used. So what are we doing here? We're here because the government has made a crass political decision. They've thought making the Leader of the Opposition stand up for 90 minutes and talk about this stuff will distract from everything else they're doing, from their utter failures in healthcare and in education, from their utter failures in the economy and affordability and sustainable jobs. They think that'll work. They've made a crass political decision, and they said the rights of this little marginalized group of people, they're kind of different. People don't all love them. They're not the most popular group. So if we go after them, it'll distract from the rest of our work. And you know what? I believed very strongly that we had a government opposite that we disagree with all the time, but one of the things we agreed on was that freedom matters, that people's human rights matter. And this government has shown this week and over and over and over again that, no, those things don't matter. Politics matter. Power matters. The Premier's ego matters. Being in the news matters. But these people's rights don't matter. That's what this government has shown. And now, of course, the question on the minds of all Albertans is what next? Who next? Members opposite have hinted strongly that they may use the notwithstanding clause next, because now that they've had a taste of it, they can use it over and over and over and over again. And they've hinted very strongly that they're going to use it on immigrants next. The Premier has not denied, when I asked her in question period, if she's planning on restricting services to non-Canadian citizens.
Members, whether or not you enjoy what you're hearing, that wasn't an invitation to interrupt me, just for the record. Whether you enjoy what you're hearing or not, we recognize the person that has the floor, and that's the only one we should hear from, and let's try that.
Who knows where we're going to go next? It wasn't even 2.5 weeks ago that the Minister of Finance stood up and said he deeply regretted using the notwithstanding clause on Bill 2. And he said, I don't foresee a circumstance where we'll use it again. And I thought that's what he said. And I wrote it down, and I went back and I checked, and he said, I don't foresee a circumstance where we'll use it again on labour relations. Yet we're about to have another strike. And we'll see if the Minister of Finance's words will be true then, if we force those workers back to work. So it started with workers, it started with teachers, now it's vulnerable youth, and it continues and it continues and it continues. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask my colleagues opposite a question. And that question is, so many of them have talked so much about fundamental human rights for so long. And I want to know how they feel about being part of the first government in Alberta history that has knowingly passed laws that they know violate people's fundamental human rights? Is this the legacy they want for themselves? Is this what they want to be remembered for? Because it is what they will be remembered for. Mercifully, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to wrap up with one final letter. This is Christian from Edmonton. I'm writing to you not just as a parent, but as someone who has proudly served his country in uniform, putting my life on the line to defend the freedoms and rights we hold dear. I never imagined that after making such sacrifices, I would have to fight to ensure that my own child is treated with the same dignity and fairness as any other Albertan. Your recent actions and rhetoric around transgender rights deeply concern me. They make our province feel less like a place of freedom and equality and more like one where certain groups are singled out and denied basic respect. This is not the Alberta or Canada. I came here to have a better life for my family. My child is not asking for special treatment. They simply want to live their life with the same rights, protections, and opportunities as everyone else. No more, no less. As Premier, your role is to ensure that every Albertan, regardless of gender identity, can feel safe, supported, and valued. I urge you to reflect on what kind of legacy you want to leave, one of division and exclusion, or one of fairness, strength, and compassion. Alberta deserves leadership that brings people together, not policies that single out vulnerable children. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge us all to take a good look at ourselves and understand that if we stand up for individual rights, if we stand up for freedom, if we stand up for the human beings who are lucky enough to share this land, we must vote against this bill. Yes.
Honourable members, the honourable member from Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the members opposite, I thank you for your point of view and your opinions. There was 90 minutes of lots of opinions and interesting information, and being a humble private member, Mr. Speaker, it's not often the Leader of the Opposition calls out a backbencher to see if they would want to speak to an important item like this, and I take that as quite the honour, Mr. Speaker. I honestly do. The point in place where we come to on Bill 9 here is literally using something from the Constitution that no one on this side takes lightly, and I hope the members opposite appreciate that, because it isn't an easy decision to bring a piece of legislation like this from a government or as a private member. There's a lot of items that we have to weigh in consideration in that, but Mr. Speaker, I don't have, again, the time, the latitude that the opposition member had, but maybe there's one place I can bring it to for the folks at home that'll understand this and maybe cut through a bit of the rhetoric. There's three different branches that we have. Obviously, we have the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive. And our forefathers were very wise to make sure that there was separation between those authorities and powers. Typically, how it works is the folks in the legislatures make the laws. The folks that are in the judiciary, they interpret the laws. And I've been on a number of conferences and courses working with lawyers and judges as well that gave us that coaching that really told us of, if you're putting laws together, here's our difficulties, so it makes us better. So it's with that we look at these circumstances and our founding fathers and the folks that did write the Constitution. And ironically, Mr. Speaker, I'm older than the Constitution in this country. I'm not that old, but I'm older than the Constitution. So a lot of these things we're pretty new at it. Like the saying this has never been used before isn't like it's been 200 years. Shoot, it's less than 50 years. So some of these things that we're going through as a young country, we are having to find our way through this process. But they were wise enough to say and understand that there is that separation, and to make full well to understand the difference. Our branch, as folks should know at home, we're elected. We are their representatives. I have the absolute honor and privilege to represent folks in Lac St. Anne Parkland, and I call it God's country nonstop. And I know that's an irritant to some of the folks next door, but with me, it's not just about the beauty of the community, it's about the people. It's literally about the people out there. As people would understand too, as a parent, people change when I was a young man, Mr. Speaker, ripped hair, pulled hair, who was a completely different person that you see standing in front of you as a man who has 3 daughters and a son. The humbling moment of seeing my first child born, it fundamentally changed me. When you become a father, at least in my circumstance, not saying all fathers are created equal and all parents aren't created equal either, or we wouldn't have a lot of these programs that we have out there. There's some people that, quite honestly, don't look out for their kids' best interest. And I can tell that full well. And I'll share a little piece of myself with the people that are heckling over there, because, you know, they're pretty thin-skinned if we say anything, Mr. Speaker, and it's obvious. But I'm going to share a little piece of me on the record. My father was physically abusive to me, not sexually abusive, physically abusive. Mentally, my mother did the same thing. There was nothing but turmoil growing up as a kid. And I can tell you full well, coming home and seeing all my stuff thrown out in the lawn, getting kicked out for being a useless so-and-so and all these things, as a kid of 12 years old, the hardest time I was ever hit and I ever got knocked down was my father swung a 2x4 at me while we're moving cattle and rattled me. So being a father and understanding and growing up in that environment and understanding some of the harm that people go through, I take offense, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, for folks to think that they can simply gloss over our personal lived life experiences or what we bring to the table when we're dealing with our constituents. But as a father, that defining moment, I knew I got a chance to make all that right. I stepped away from all my past and I worked really hard to make sure that I had good mentors and good people around me. And when I heard a calling in my community, I answered that call to step up, to help out. And Mr. Speaker, I've said it in here before, and the member from Glenora laughed when I said it, and we'll see if she does the same thing. When I walk into the room, I walk in knowing I am not the smartest person in the room. When I do that, I don't pontificate, and I'm not an arrogant so-and-so that sits up there and has condescending things. I listen to other people. But I'm also up there to make sure that when I'm doing these type of things that I bring my own life experience to it. So we're weighing those measures out. And the other thing that we do, Mr. Speaker, I myself personally, is when we're putting legislation through here, I have to trust it to the opposition. Now, I think most of them are well-intended. God's honest truth, I believe they do. But we come from a different standpoint. So to have this vilification going back and forth is not helpful. To have some of these issues thrown out and make people scared, it's not helpful. It wasn't so long ago we saw a young man, Charlie Kirk, down the States get executed, shot, and literally killed over this. If we can't have a place where we can come to and understand that everyone's had life experiences and problems going through this and challenges and trying to do the best for Albertans, that we lose what this place was intended for. It's with that, on this very sensitive issue. This isn't one to play political football with. We passed a piece of legislation in here. We went through the democratic process. Rightly or wrongly, whether you're on one side of it or the other, it passed. It reached royal assent. Now we're at this really weird tipping point. Folks at home may not understand that judges and lawyers are not elected. They're appointed. And there's good reason for that. Maybe. Different systems do it differently around, but they were appointed. We recently saw the Supreme Court of Canada say that having child pornography is okay. 5-4 decision, I believe, or somewhere around there by 1. But they literally took and said the person that has and possesses that filth, that does that to small children, that harms children, that that's okay.
Has the NDP
brutal precedent to set. So when we're looking at all the data that's coming out, we're looking at the science on this, we're looking at other jurisdictions, we're listening to all of the conversations of what happens when you influence children or you change something fundamental. And I grew up on the farm, Mr. Speaker. I know what castration is. There's a difference. You're not going to grow back those parts, Mr. Speaker, if you change your mind. If the steer changes his mind, too late, you're a steer. And when we have kids that are subject to different circumstances and influences, and again, coming back to my own story, not all parents are created equal. A lot of members opposite, I said it earlier, you're social workers. You have to understand this. We're all doing this with the best intent to make sure. So when we have things like this, is not an absolute, Mr. Speaker. It's not an absolute saying that every parent's good. You have to defend parents' rights right to the end, unless they're bad parents, and that's why we've got all these other checks and balances. We want to make sure that these kids, God bless them, they get to a point of maturity where they can make that decision, and that their parents, best intentions or maybe not, I don't know, but best intentions don't cause irreparable damage. We've heard a number of the people that have gone through these transitions regret it and they go back. The suicide rates go up, and again, it's not settled. And some of these drugs, it's not like they're common everyday thing. This is nothing that happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We don't have the data. This was not the norm. We find ourselves in this weird construct, the social construct that we're trying to navigate through. But being a dad, being a father, being an MLA, sometimes doing the right thing is the toughest thing you'll ever do, but it's the right thing to do. I never ran to get reelected, not once. The folks in my community know that. I gave them a job interview. I said, if you hired me, it's your fault. You hired me. I'm going to do the job to my best ability. If I'm 100% solid on a topic, I'm going to be that elected representative, elected democracy, representative democracy. If I got problems, I'll do that testing. I test with my own colleagues. I test across the aisle. I listen to what's going on. I do the best research I can. And I come back to the same thing. On this particular case, we've seen a weird precedence taking place out in our judiciary that's making decisions that I cannot look in the mirror on, nor represent my constituents from what they've given me in their feedback, nor from what I've heard across the province, nor across the country for that matter. And we see other jurisdictions across the pond over in Europe, they're having the same problems, the same challenges, and they're rolling back some of these things. A sober second thought? That's what we want to go to the mat on over here? This is what we want to scare people about? And start espousing all these other things to get people all riled up? There's enough going on out there, for crying out loud. Let people understand that in this place we will have fulsome debates, but we are all intended to do the best we can for them. And that's what this does. Bill 9 does that, Mr. Speaker. It's not swinging that big stick lightly. But with the precedents and doing that, you have to make sure that you're doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. And is it politically going to be difficult? Could it be something misconstrued and used out there to get the public up and riled? Absolutely. And would I still make the same decision and ask my colleagues to do the same, and the members from across the aisle to support us on this, to make sure we give that pause, to make sure that we get these laws through that have been passed in this House, and they may not be hijacked by someone who's appointed, who has different motivators that we don't. They are not held accountable to the same way that we are at the polls every 4 years when an electoral cycle, or going into the grocery stores, or going into your community, or going into those schools. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I strongly encourage everybody to support this bill.
Honourable members, it is now 6 p.m. and the House stands adjourned until 1:30 tomorrow afternoon.